Hey Busy Bees, today I am going to be reading chapter 30 in Serafina and the Twisted Staff. Serafina watched Graythan as he stood on the path. He tilted his head as if listening for the sound of another howl. Then, after several long seconds, he hurried up the path with new urgency. When Graythan finally went around a bend in the path and disappeared, Serafina held her position. She sensed that Braden and Rowena were anxious to move. They weren't used to long periods of stillness like she was, but she kept them there, her hands holding them in place for several minutes longer, until she was sure it was truly safe. Finally, she looked at her companions, lifted her finger to her lips, and then pointed towards Biltmore. The three of them ran home without saying a word. Serafina could easily run faster than both of them, but she took up the rear, watching behind them to make sure Graythan had not doubled back. She knew there would come a point in the near future when she would have to fight him, but the last thing she wanted was to confront him now, unprepared, in the darkened forest with her two companions. She had to find a way to gain an advantage over him. As they reached the outer edge of the garden, she was glad to see the faint lights of Biltmore in the distance. "Did you see that?" Lady Rowena said proudly as they hurried towards the mansion's side door. "He walked right past us and didn't even see us." She crouched down and moved her hands in front of her like she was a master of stealth. "I was totally invisible. I was like a thief in the night." Serafina smiled, but Braden looked confused. "Where was he going?" he asked. "What's out there in the woods?" "I told you we can't trust that man," Rowena said. "Let's hurry back to the house," Serafina said as they crossed the lawn. "There's a formal dinner tonight," Braden said, seeming to sense what she was thinking. "So the house is going to be very busy." "As soon as things quiet down after dinner is over and everyone goes to bed," Serafina said, "I'll sneak up to the third floor and search Graythan's room." Serafina took them through the side door, and then they hid in the shadows beneath the grand staircase and gazed out across the entrance hall. The house was softly lit with candles placed here and there on the mantels and tables, which gave the rooms an almost ethereal feeling. It was very quiet, save for the gentle music of violins and cellos playing in the banquet hall. It was good to see the Vanderbilt families and all of their friends celebrating together. Serafina loved all of the ladies' sparkling dresses. Christmas Eve was just a few nights away. A beautiful, formally dressed young lady in her early 20s and a handsome young gentleman slowly descended the grand staircase arm in arm. The young man wore black tails, a white tie, and white gloves. Serafina loved the way the silver buttons on his shirt and vest glinted in the candlelight and matched the watch chain dangling from his pocket. The young lady on his arm wore a voluminous silvery dress with cap shoulders, a top corset, and a long train that swished as it dropped from step to step as she came majestically down the stairs. She wore graceful white satin gloves and carried a silvery folding fan that matched her dress. A ring of shimmering pearls encircled her neck. Her dark hair had been swept up and arranged in the most elaborate coiffure Serafina had ever seen. "Who's that?" Lady Rowena asked, entranced. "Her Grace Consuelo Vanderbilt, Duchess of Marlborough," Braden said quietly, "and her husband Charles Richard John Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, my cousins." Serafina smiled. She had no idea how he remembered names like that, but the girl sure was pretty. She loved the way Duchess Consuelo lilted her fan as she walked. Serafina watched breathlessly as the young couple sauntered through the entrance hall and around the winter garden on their way to the evening meal. In the banquet hall, the servants were preparing the 40-foot-long main table for the 8 o'clock dinner, and all the gentlemen in their black tails and white ties escorted their ladies in their long, formal dinner gowns. The shine of silver platters and a sparkle of crystal glasses in the candlelight seemed bright compared to the darkness from which she, Braden, and Lady Rowena had just come. "Y'all better go upstairs and get changed for dinner," Serafina whispered to her companions. "When you go to bed tonight, stay safe. Lock your doors. Tomorrow, get that information we talked about. And keep your eyes peeled for new clues." "Got it," Braden said. "Will do," Lady Rowena agreed. As Lady Rowena split off and went up the grand staircase, Serafina couldn't help but feel surprised by the girl. She was not at all what Serafina had expected. "What are you going to do now, Serafina?" Braden asked when Lady Rowena was gone. "I'm going to keep watch," she said. "I'll watch with you," he said. Serafina looked at him. "You don't have to do that, Braden. Go get dinner with your family and then go to bed. Get some sleep. I'm just glad I'm home." "I couldn't sleep when you're gone, and I'm sure not going to sleep now that you're back," he said. She looked at him and felt the warmth of his words moving through her. "Thank you, Braden," she said. "It was the same way for me. I'm none too eager to run away again, believe me." Smiling, Braden said, "Let's go tell my uncle that I'm back, and then I'll meet you here." "What about your dinner?" she asked, gesturing towards the glittering folk gathering in the banquet hall in the distance. "What about yours?" he asked, moving his hand in an inviting way towards the gathering. "I'm sure we can find a gown for you to wear." Serafina smiled uncomfortably, feeling a new kind of fear rolling up inside of her. "Thank you," she said hesitantly, "but I'm not quite ready for that." He nodded, understanding. "Then where are you going to eat your dinner?" "My pa grills chicken on the cook stove in the workshop," she said. "Sounds good, if you and your pa wouldn't mind another mouth to feed," he said. Yes, that would be fine," she stammered, surprised and a little scared at the idea of Braden eating supper with her and her pa. "What about Lady Rowena? Won't she miss you at dinner?" "Oh, Lady Rowena may need us in the woods, but she does not need us at a dinner party. That's her home territory, and she'll do fine without us. Let me just go ask my uncle to excuse me from joining the dinner tonight, and I'll send a message to Rowena so she doesn't think I got absorbed into a black cloak or something." Serafina smiled, and before she could stop him, he walked away and did exactly what he said he would. He spoke briefly to his uncle, and to Serafina's amazement, walked right back to her. There was no conflict or argument. "Lead the way," he said, grinning. "I'm starving." When she walked into the workshop with Braden at her side, her pa nearly dropped dead from shock, but he made the best of the situation as quickly as he could. He pulled up a bench stool and wiped it off for Braden to sit on. He gave Braden his sharpest pocket knife to cut his chicken with, and he even managed to cobble together what looked impressively similar to a napkin for Braden's lap. Serafina just sat back, ate her chicken, and smiled at the sight of the two of them sitting together and trying to chat. Braden used such refined English, and her pa used such mountain talk that sometimes she had to help them understand each other. For the first time in her life, she felt she didn't just belong, but like she was the glue that held the world together. After dinner, Serafina invited Braden to do what she imagined friends all over America did after a good meal together. They went rat catching. "My pa told me that some sort of rodent has been chewing at the wires," Serafina explained. "Then let's get to it," Braden agreed. As the last of the gilded ladies and gentlemen upstairs retired to their bedrooms for the evening, and as the servants cleaned up the banquet hall, Serafina led Braden through the back rooms of the basement. In an hour or so, when everyone was asleep, she'd sneak up to Graython's room on the 3rd floor and search it, but until then, the hunt was afoot. They prowled the darkened corridors and shadowed storage rooms of her old domain, bringing back memories of her life in the world below. After all that had happened to her over the last few weeks, she thought catching a couple wire-chewing rats would make for easy pickings. But she and Braden searched and searched, and they couldn't find them. As the night wore on, it became more and more perplexing. She used her eyes and ears and her nose just as she always did, but the rats were nowhere to be found. Her pa had said there were rats in the house, and she was the chief rat catcher. She always found her rats, but for some reason she could not find them tonight. "Is it me?" Braden asked. "Am I making too much noise?" "No, I don't think that's it," Serafina said. "We're checking all of their favorite hiding spots. If they're down here, we should be seeing them at least." "What about upstairs?" She shook her head. "There aren't any rats upstairs. I'd never let them get that far." She frowned, not sure what to do. "Maybe your pa was mistaken about the rats," Braden said. "It's possible," she said, "but I saw the wires, and they definitely looked like they'd been chewed." Just after midnight, she and Braden gave up the hunt and went back upstairs to the main floor. There was no one there. All the lights were off, and the candles had been extinguished. The servants had gone to their rooms upstairs and down. The musicians had closed up their cases and gone home for the night. The banquet hall and all the other rooms on the main floor were empty and dark. "Come on," she said, waving for him to follow her as she crept up the darkened grand staircase. "We'll search Graython's room." At the top of the 2nd floor, they hunkered down and looked upward to make sure the stairs were clear, then padded quietly up to the next level. When they reached the 3rd floor, they crouched down once more, protected by nothing but darkness and the sweep of a staircase. At that moment, Serafina realized they were in the exact location where she and Gideon had gone over the railing. She looked over into the dark, empty living hall. The moon shone in through the windows, casting the room in an eerie silver light. A shiver ran through her. She heard something on the other side of the living hall. When she looked at Braden, she could tell by his expression that he had heard it too. It was faint and difficult to make out. She cupped her hands behind her ears to amplify the sound. Then she heard it again. A faint slithering just ahead. The scrambling of tiny feet on bare floor. She touched Braden rather than use her voice, and together they crept forward along the wall. When the sound stopped, they stopped as well. When the sound resumed, they crept forward once more. Now she could hear the creatures breathing, the scratching of their toenails on the floor, and the dragging of their tails. She felt the familiar trembling in her fingers and the tightness in her legs. "It's the rats," she whispered to Braden. They crept slowly and quietly across the darkened living hall until they reached the corridor between the north tower and the south. When she peeked around the corner, a dark fear boomed in her chest. At the end of this corridor was the cabinet with the hidden door that led to the attic where the chimney swifts had attacked her. Were the rats in there? She stepped slowly forward, still listening, still trying to figure out exactly where the rodents were. She heard what sounded like the grinding teeth of 100 rats. She was now standing in the exact spot where Gideon had attacked her that night. "Serafina," Braden whispered, his voice filled with terror as his trembling hand searched for and then touched her arm. And then she saw it. Attached to the wall was a large wooden fire alarm box with a glass front and brass instrumentations inside. It had been there for years, but crammed inside of the box tonight was a mass of rolling dark fur and scaly tails. Their gnawing teeth clicked like the sound of 1,000 cockroaches. The rats were chewing on the electrical wires. She watched the rats in horror, too shocked to move. Braden clutched her arm tighter. Then the sound stopped abruptly. All at once, all the rats craned their necks and looked at her. A large, grisly-looking rat crawled out of the box, then another followed it. The rats, seemingly half out of their minds, rose up onto their back legs and stared at Serafina. Then they all started moving towards her. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. She wasn't hunting them. They were hunting her. Filled with fierceness, she charged towards them, wondering how she was going to catch them all. But they weren't moving like normal rats move. They weren't scurrying away in fear at her, at the sight of her. They ran toward her. "Serafina," Braden whispered in terror, looking around. When Serafina looked down, she saw what he was seeing. Hundreds of spiders and centipedes crawling out of the woodwork. "Serafina!" Braden cried again as he frantically wiped the spiders off of his legs. Serafina heard a terrible tick-tick-ticking sound and a long, raspy hiss. She felt the hot air of a breath on the back of her neck. She spun around in panic, but there was nothing there except a darkened corridor. "Braden, run!" she shouted. They turned and ran. They tore through the living hall and down the grand staircase. She glanced over her shoulder. A brown, slithering carpet of hundreds of rats flooded down the staircase behind her. It was like a waterfall of rats. She burst forward with speed, but Braden couldn't run nearly as fast as she could. The rats were going to eat him alive. But just as she slowed down to wait for him, something flashed by her. "Come on, slowpoke!" Braden shouted as he slid at incredible speed down the endless, smooth wooden railing of the spiral staircase. The wave of rats slammed into her feet and scratched their way up her bare legs. She tried to tear them away, but it was no use. There were too many of them. She took a flying leap onto the rail, grabbed on, and went sliding down behind Braden. It felt like she'd been dropped off the edge of a cliff. The swoosh of her spinning descent made her insides float. She and Braden slid down, spiraling down to the next level, then ran and leapt and slid again, following the great curve of the railing all the way down to the main floor. When they reached the bottom, they leapt off the rail and ran down into the basement. Serafina knew she shouldn't, but at the bottom of the basement stairs, she turned and looked behind her.